Good evening, CR family. Welcome. Glad to see you again. I pray you fathers out there had a blessed Father's Day yesterday. Oh, no, that was Sunday. I know I did. One of the best Father's Days I ever had. It really took my mind off the chaos in the world and quarantine, and it was just a joyful time. Anyway, I'd like to welcome you to CR. Tonight, Concepcion is going to read a powerful testimony. So sit back, strap in, and I hope you enjoy this as much as we do.
Good evening, CR family. My name is Concepcion. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, and I struggle with having been physically, sexually, and emotionally abused as a child. So I've got a testimony tonight from our Life Sealing Choices 10th Anniversary Edition. And it starts out with, I am a grateful believer of follower of Jesus Christ, and I struggle with alcohol and addiction, and my name is Ken. So this is Ken's story. I have falsely believed that my greatest strength was being self-reliant, and that belief gave me a great sense of pride. Self-reliance was a tool I used to protect myself from relationships. I didn't grow up in a healthy home, and I had only a few safe people in my life, so I learned early to take care of myself. God has blessed me with some incredible gifts, but it wasn't until I was in recovery that I learned to use them for the purpose described in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm 3 years younger than my oldest sister and 14 months younger than my older brother. When I was born, my father owned his own stock brokerage firm, and my mother was working toward her nursing degree. We lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs of Boston, and from the outside, everything probably looked perfect, but it wasn't. My father controlled our home. My earliest memories of my father were him yelling at my mother and us kids. He demanded the best of us, in public or private, and I learned not to do or say anything that made my dad angry. My mom was in school, but she struggled with depression. When I was a very young child, she tried to commit suicide. They admitted her to a psychiatric facility. I remember that my grandma Stella took care of us any time Mom was sick. We moved to Texas in 1973 when my father's business failed. I learned when I was a little older that my father had stolen his investors' money and that he was running away. At this time, my mom was working in nursing and she was the breadwinner of our home. My father always seemed angry. Anything would set him off. When my brother or I were in trouble, he would discipline us with a paddle. It was bad. But what I hated the most was the way he talked to me. Everything was a lecture. I was a good student, and school was a refuge for me, but every report card was a lecture. He would say, A's aren't good enough, they should be A pluses. I learned not to ask for help with homework because he would tell me how simple it was, and that he couldn't understand why I didn't get it. Every school conversation started with him reminding me that he was valedictorian of his high school and that he got a scholarship to MIT. No matter how well I did at something, he was always better, so I quit asking for help. It seemed Mom was working or sleeping all the time. Neither Mom nor Dad attended our school functions or Little League games. There were many times when the game or practice ended and no one picked me up. This first happened when I was 6 years old. After waiting for what seemed a long time, I walked home in the dark. I remember being scared and crying, but when I got home, I found Mom asleep, and I didn't want to make her sad. This happened a lot over the years, so I found rides when I could and walked when I couldn't. I was learning the rules for keeping our home happy. Telling Dad I needed anything from him makes him mad, and telling Mom makes her sad. Basically, I learned that talking about my problems would only make other people upset, so I shouldn't talk about my problems. I was becoming a people pleaser and very codependent. I'd even take responsibility for things I didn't do just to keep the peace. We moved again when I was 10, and I got my first job as a paper boy. I was so proud. My dad helped me open my first bank account, and I got to keep $5 of every paycheck. I deposited the rest in my bank account. I saved all year, and at Christmas, I decided to go to the bank and withdraw $50 to buy Christmas presents. I rode my bike to the bank and made out a withdrawal slip. They told me there was no money in my account. I was so sad that I started crying and couldn't stop. One of the bank tellers took me to an office where she explained that my father had withdrawn my money. My father had stolen my money. This was when I stopped trusting or believing him. We moved a couple more times in and around the Houston area, and when I was 13, I had my first drink. I drank 2 beers and felt the effects. It didn't scare me. It felt good. When I drank, I didn't feel shy. I felt confident. I could talk with girls. What was going on? I had never felt this good. I thought alcohol was a gift to cure my shyness and social anxiety. It was during this time that my parents divorced. I was 13. After the divorce, my dad disappeared from my life. I started drinking regularly and even trying a few drugs. I didn't miss his drama. It was then that a family friend entered my life, seeming to have my best interest at heart. He was a former teacher. With my mother's approval, he began spending time with me. He was friendly and always willing to spend time with me. He never treated me like a 14-year-old, and we did lots of fun things together. He would let me drink, and he introduced other drugs into our time spent together. Since I never had a good relationship with my father, I desperately sought his approval. He eventually introduced pornography into our time, and then the sexual abuse began. He played on my adolescent desires and manipulated me, but I never told anyone. This abuse lasted for about 2 years and only ended when I quit being available to spend time with him. When I would think about this time of my life, I felt irrational rage at him, my parents, and myself. I hated how he used me and that I never told anyone. I remembered the fun we'd had together and that I thought he cared about me. Then I would remember how he'd manipulated me, and I would hate myself even more. I was brought up believing in God. My mother was raised Catholic, and when we attended church, it was with my mom. I was baptized as an infant, and we attended church periodically. As a teen, I accepted Christ as my Lord, and I knew what I was doing when I invited him into my life, but that was all I did. Since I didn't attend church regularly, I didn't understand that believing in Christ also meant having a relationship with him. I remember feeling changed for a while, but within a few weeks, I was back to my old ways. I would spend the next 11 years with my back to God. One Father's Day, shortly after I graduated from high school, I was thinking about my dad and missing him. I thought about how much had happened over the past 4 years. I was crying and told God that I couldn't continue to hope my father would return. I told God that I would give my dad until my 18th birthday to make contact, or I was going to write him off. I fully expected to write off my dad, but God had other plans. 1 week before my 18th birthday, my dad knocked on our door. He hadn't changed in his manner or personality, but God had answered my prayer/demand. So I didn't write off my dad. My dad was back in my life, but my alcoholism, addictions, and other problems were just beginning. I was arrested twice over the next 2 years, once for fighting in public and once for breaking into a car that I thought was mine. After my second arrest, my mother tried to get me into rehab, but I talked my way out of the intervention. In college, I was maybe a little more careful about my drinking and using, but they continued without much control on my part. I met my first wife while in school, and we made the perfect couple to the outside world. We both drank and had train wrecks of family histories, but didn't judge each other. We both came from broken homes. I didn't know anything about having a healthy relationship, trusting, or intimacy, and God wasn't in our home. It wasn't 6 months until we started sleeping in separate rooms and living separate lives. I knew how to put on a happy face for family and friends, but I wasn't a good husband. I got my first job in business and worked hard. I was promoted to the position of accounting administrator. It seemed like we would be set, but within 2 years, I started stealing from the company. I was already spending many nights out drinking at gentlemen's clubs and was pretending to be a big shot. Once I started stealing, the stealing became its own drug. I was miserable at home and was enjoying this fake world I had created. It took almost 2 years for them to discover my thefts. By then, it was $70,000. The owner of the company, Royce, confronted me. He wanted to meet with me and my wife to discuss the theft and how to repay it. I told him that she didn't know anything about it and asked for a couple of days to break the news to her. He agreed, but I had other plans. First, I knew we had no way to repay the debt and that I would probably end up in prison. How could I explain to Royce what I had used the money for when no one knew about my private life? How was I going to explain to my wife that I wasn't working hard to get ahead, but stealing to preserve that life outside our home? I had become an expert at lying, blaming, and manipulating, but I didn't see how I was going to cover this up with a lie. In what I expected to be my final act of self-reliance, I decided to end my life. I wouldn't tell anyone anything, and once I was gone, who would care? For more than 27 years, I had managed to not even have one close personal relationship, including my wife. That night, I came home late and took a bottle of sleeping pills. The next morning, I wasn't dead. I was in the emergency room where I had to write out the hallucinations. I still remember playing an imaginary game of cards with Christ as angels flew around the room. I know I was delusional because of the overdose, but the memory of my emergency room visit still gives me comfort today. Even though I didn't have a good relationship with Christ, He was still with me on my worst day. Today, I recognize the truth of Romans 5:8. God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God did for me what I could not do for myself. He helped reveal the truth of my life when I was too much of a coward to do it myself, and He still loved me. That morning was the beginning of my recovery journey. I wish I could say that it was easy going, but to be honest, I didn't know if I could get clean and sober. I did attend my first AA meeting, and I also met with Royce. That meeting was very uncomfortable, but I experienced a miracle of mercy. Royce was a man of God and demonstrated God's mercy to me. He was direct but told me that against his better judgment, he wouldn't press charges. He did expect full compensation, and he wanted to give me a chance to turn my life around. I would love to tell you that my life turned around right then, but it has taken some time for me to grow in my recovery and my relationship with Christ. I stayed clean and sober for 7 months, only to relapse and find myself wishing to die again. That was my last relapse and my bottom. It was when I realized I wouldn't be able to remain clean and sober without help. I started attending AA again and got a sponsor and began working the steps. I also began to reconnect with my higher power, Jesus Christ. I had been through many difficult times in my recovery, including divorce from my first wife and taking responsibility for my part. However, I was reading my Bible one evening and came across what is now my life scripture. I was reading about Paul and his thorns, and I realized that my biggest thorn is self-reliance. When I rely on myself, I can't experience 2 Corinthians 12:9, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." When I rely on God, my greatest weakness becomes God's most powerful tool. During my recovery, I met my wife, Tammy. We were both divorced and weren't going to rush into marriage again. We dated and discussed all the things we would do differently, and both of us knew we would be more involved in church. We started looking for a church to attend together and discovered High Point Fellowship. We knew that was where we should attend. I chose to be baptized before the church. Tammy and I began serving whenever there was a need. I shared my testimony with my pastor and asked if he would allow me to host an AA meeting at the church. He agreed, but asked if I would look at the Celebrate Recovery materials. After I read about the program, we began the process of launching Celebrate Recovery. Since beginning Celebrate Recovery, I have experienced an entirely different and wonderful life. I have practiced applying the steps and principles in my daily walk with God. Work in recovery has changed my life and allowed me to reconcile relationships that I thought would be impossible to restore. God had already answered my prayer to bring my father back into my life. My father never became healthy or even trustworthy, but over the years, we got to know each other as adults, and God gave me the opportunity to see my dad's many struggles. I was able to forgive my father and have a relationship with him. In 2010, my father spent his last days in this world in hospice at my home. I was with him as he took his last breath in this world and his next in heaven. We never had a perfect relationship, but when he took that last breath, his hand was in mine. He knew he was loved by his son. I cherish that memory and am grateful to honor him in my walk with God. Practicing evaluating my relationships with my abuser, however, was something I struggled with in my early recovery. Today, I recognize the truth that as a child, I have no part to own in the sexual abuse I suffered. I don't own any guilt or shame or remorse. I was a victim. Yet I have also discovered another truth. The forgiveness I offer my abuser frees me. Offering my forgiveness to my abuser has also helped me to see where I have hurt others. This choice has given me freedom from the rage and self-hatred I suffered in silence for so many years. It took many years to repay my financial debt to Royce. We would speak on the phone a few times a year, and in many ways he became a mentor. It always seemed strange that he was even willing to talk with me. I was able to ask and receive Royce's forgiveness, and I made a complete financial amends. God has used my experience to help others, but he had even more planned. On July 12, 2013, Royce's wife Rose called me to let me know Royce had died. I was sad but also humbled that she would take the time in her grief to call me. We talked for a few minutes, and she knew I was serving in ministry and would share my testimony. She then asked if I would be willing to share it at Royce's funeral. I have never been so honored or humbled as when I was allowed to minister to Royce's family and friends in their time of grief and loss. I shared how God placed Royce in my life as an instrument of God's love, mercy, and grace when I felt deserving of none. I am grateful to now serve with the broken, hurting, and helpless, and I love watching how God demonstrates his power in weakness. I'm amazed to experience this verse from Lamentations. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. I am excited to see what God has planned next in my life.
Well, thank you for that powerful, gripping testimony. At this point, I'd like to read the Serenity Prayer to you, so you can join in if you like. You probably have this memorized. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. God bless you all. See you next week.